I'd like also to invite Kevin and Mark Bartolome. He's our third guest, basically. He will do also a presentation later on, but he joins us on our panel as the IoT expert. He was with Horizon for 20 years. Now he's CEO of his own company. And he's expert in smart cities and the Internet of Things. As far as I understand, you can send your questions directly to the app, as well as we will ask you questions during the panel session. But maybe I kick off the panel with some questions from my side. And as this event was structured to be not only for investors, but more a family event, I'd like to ask you my first question, all three of you. What kind of skill sets should the next generation have, and what kind of new jobs would you expect, let's say in banking, blockchain, in artificial intelligence, also Internet of Things? Maybe Peter, can we start with you?
Yes, sure. Is this still on?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So it's difficult to predict, but the advice I give to my own kids, quite frankly, is to have a very inquiring mind, to be very open, not to be too specialist. I think technology, and especially the sort of technology that was being discussed first this morning, is getting very good at very specialist actions. And so I think being an absolute specialist is the area in the employment area to be under threat, and to be more of a generalist and be able to deal with multiple complex skills is the way for humans, certainly for the next generation or two, to excel.
Mark, what would you say?
I actually look at it a little bit differently. Rather than specializing in any one area, I think that the big skills are going to need to be, is that on now?
Yeah.
The skills are really going to need to cross many, many disciplines. So people need to understand the social issues, people need to understand the engineering issues, people need to understand the artistic elements of innovation. So there's a great book that came out last year on Leonardo da Vinci, and I think that it really talks about the reason his theories were so successful is because he was able to bridge engineering and art. And so I think that well-rounded education for the people coming through our universities is very important.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I was trying to say.
Yeah,
I was saying actually the computers will be the ones who take out the specialists. Yeah. They will deal with it. Okay.
I think you're saying the same thing. I would totally agree with both of you. And I mean, for my, just for perspective, I studied sculpture, right? So that, that's how you get to do this. Nice. But I think to get at it more specifically around some of the things that I was talking about in the presentation, I think that a lot of roles will move towards something that we would now call analyst roles. Like architects will become architect analysts in the sense that they will be working with systems of unimaginable complexity and uninterpretable or inexplicable complexity, and that their jobs will be doing whatever it is they're doing now, but will also have to be able to analyze increasingly complex systems. And so I think the capability to buttress whatever it is with the capability to understand these systems, not exactly how they work because you can't, but how to feel them in the same way that good analysts can understand what's happening in the market without being privy to every piece of information in it. They can understand what the overall sensibilities are. And I think that fundamental skill, which we associate with finance, I think will move through to every profession, because every profession will be dealing with market size pools of data. So,
thank you very much. Maybe more top-down question. In Europe, Google had to pay a big fine last year, and clients were asking us whether, in the meantime, tech companies are slowly becoming too big to fail, and whether we need more regulation. Would you agree? I mean, from US perspective, you're much closer to the big platforms. We in Europe, frankly speaking, missed the first part of the fourth industrial revolution. I mean, all the big platforms whether it's Google, Facebook, eBay, Alibaba, Baidu and so on, are all in Asian or US hands, and basically in Europe we have nothing, so hopefully we don't miss the second part of the fourth industrial revolution regarding all the industrial applications. But would you say that tech companies are slowly become too big to fail? Maybe?
Yeah. So I worked in an industry, the telecommunications industry, that was very heavily regulated, both federally and state and local. High taxes involved on a local basis, very complex to manage. But I favored a very participatory regulatory process. From a technology standpoint, I thought that regulations, very often, if they were done with a high level of participation, could help accelerate technology. And I saw this in the deployment of smart grid solutions back in the early 90s, when there was no agreement on things like the standards for a unified smart grid infrastructure. And we also saw this in the railroad industry with the Railroad Safety Act of 2005, which defined the standards for positive train control. And then we're seeing it today with the recent Food Safety Act and the Drug Safety Acts, which are defining, how we'll track the shipments of drugs and maintain the safety of our food supply. But if it's not done without industry participation, then it does become very bureaucratic and it doesn't accomplish the goals.
The others, thanks.
I think maybe the thing to sort of press on is what would failure, when we say too big to fail, what does fail mean? So just just an hour ago, Twitter announced that it had its first profitable quarter ever. But it also, may have, it is generally agreed upon to have had a substantive effect in destroying the fabric of democracy in the United States. So, which one is failure, right? Was it more successful before it could have the scale to achieve that, or is it more successful now that it's profitable? And I think that the questions around regulation really belong to what priorities do we have, and if the priorities are I think the questions that are coming up around the big tech companies, they're not. I don't hear as many questions around regulation of any tech industries except those around social platforms. I feel like that's the primary question that's getting asked, and I guess the question is who's going to figure out what the criteria are there? Who's going to determine it, and how would you possibly enforce it? And I think that until very recently, you see small examples of it in Oregon. Facebook was just somehow the Fair Campaign Finance was used to prevent them from engaging in certain kinds of practices. But I think the question is, where will that pressure come from? Because it probably won't come from the market, and that's what makes it complicated, right? So that's my.
So we're already starting to see some. So if you look, the European General Data Protection Act, this is coming, and this is industry agnostic, but I think quite frankly it seems to be aimed at the big tech companies and looking after people's personal data. And so we're seeing that coming, and I think we'll probably see more privacy issues come up, and there may be more regulation happening off the back of it. But one of the things I always like to think about at the moment is, regulation should really be technology agnostic, and it should really be around what you're doing with technology. And somehow, some of the big tech companies are managing to play the reality distortion field, and you look at especially the social media companies that we were talking about then. You look at the fact that what they're really doing is quite similar to what the press does. And the press is a very heavily regulated industry, and they cannot do a lot of the things which social media is currently getting away with. I don't think that's new regulation required at all. I think that's taking away the distortion field and understanding what they're actually fundamentally doing and applying the existing regulations to these companies. and then leveling that playing field if it is a level playing field. So I think there is probably something about privacy. I think there's an element of people do not understand where this free internet is coming from. They do not understand the value of the data that they're giving away. That is probably what is new in all of this. You know, the huge amounts of personal data which previously just sort of existed in your own head and is now sort of being released out into the world, but actually then being put into some very powerful tech companies to use with as they wish in unusual ways, which you are really not privy to. I think that is probably new, and that probably requires a new set of thinking. But other things, I think, is an element of what are you doing, how does it align to what we're already regulating, and what's the impact?
Okay, one of our key topics today in this session is technological disruption. And when I always read the research reports from our tech and consumer analysts, it's always interesting to see that Alibaba, for instance, Alibaba is a kind of Amazon in China. Alibaba has more e-commerce sales than the entire e-commerce sector in the US. So you can see how big Alibaba is in the meantime. So my question to you is, and also when I read the stats, Alibaba reported $25 billion US sales on its one Singles Day. Singles Day is an important sales day in China. This is 4 times the combined 3-day holiday spending of the entire US in e-commerce sales. Why is Alibaba disrupting much faster in emerging markets than what we see in developed markets? What would you say? Is this because there is not enough old infrastructure which makes it easier, or what would you say is the main reason?
So I think there's an element of that. You've got, you know, a lot of the big tech giants in China have a very unique ecosystem. We sort of coin it the Galapagos of fintech or of tech. You know, they're a very isolated environment with a huge population. So without crossing borders, without going to the outside world and having all the complexity of different rules and different governments, they can grow to phenomenal scale. And then, to your point, there's desire, there's need, there's inclusion issues, there were issues with the services not being available. So there was the ability, especially with desire from the government to support this sort of stuff, to accelerate very, very fast. I think what's getting interesting now is to see how they start to make the play as they cross those borders. You're starting to see them making, it starts through the idea that they're going to provide services to Chinese citizens who are overseas, be that tourists or expats. But also you see a lot of the sort of One Belt, One Road program coming through and that development of infrastructure through those various corridors. They're part of all of that big plan. So it's going to be interesting to see how that develops and how that moves forward. But I think you're right. You sometimes have the first mover disadvantage. Much as you look at sort of the London tube system, it's looking a bit creaky and antiquated now because it's old and it'd be so difficult to replace. Whereas places that have more recently got a nice tube system is much less complex. They've got nice air conditioning, escalators all work, it's all perfect. So I think there's quite often people forget there's a sort of last mover advantage. You can learn from the mistakes of others and then go fast.
I don't have the domain expertise to say whether it's substantively faster or just at greater scale, and I don't know the answer to that. But what I'm interested in from the neighborhoods where I hang out in terms of innovation in Asia and disruption is what's called Shanzai, and Shanzai is a type of innovation in manufacturing, and it's happening very quietly. What happens in major manufacturing in China is that what you read about and what we're all invested in, whatever, is Foxconn, and there's these sort of mega factories and people who live in the factory and so on. But in fact, really a lot of the manufacturing that goes on there is really in kind of garages, and it'll be like a very specific, like just the polishing of the glass, and it's really done by hand or with a small and newly affordable machine. It looks more like, say, medieval Renaissance craftspeople level situation, except that they are networked and all on top of one another. And so that's basically how these things get made. We think of them as coming out of robots and huge factories, but in fact they're made like that. But the interesting thing is that it's the people who are making just those little parts, because they live with them and because they live with those parts and they're making those parts, and because they spend all day with this, they've started making their own. And so if you go to the Shenzhen manufacturing province, you'll see people with phones where they're effectively handmade, and maybe somebody made like 10,000 of them or 50,000 of them maybe, and they're phones that look like their favorite sneaker, or they're phones that have a menstruation calculator because somebody thought that would be useful, and it's just built in because that's what happens. But the interesting thing that's happening, the thing to pay attention to, is that the kinds of rapid innovation that we associate with software is starting to happen in manufacturing. And I feel like it's very far below the radar right now, and it's actually very important. And I know of 2 firms that actually have people embedded now in the Shenzhen manufacturing province who are just watching to see the way that many people are watching to look for disruption to happen at small scale at first in software. How do we notice that in terms of hardware? And that's the most interesting area to me.
Thanks. I have several questions of all of you. Maybe Mark, the first one to you. How will, because we spoke about consumer, how will the Internet of Things change retail? Can you, I mean, it's maybe not your home turf, but maybe you have some insights.
So I mean, there's the physical retail that still exists today. I think even when we talk about Amazon and Alibaba, it still represents a relatively small percentage of the total consumer dollars being spent worldwide, although rapidly growing. And where I see physical retail, the use of Internet of Things to track people's journey through the store and to actually engage them before they even come to the store, to create expectation and to be able to create an experience before they actually arrive, and then manage that experience for exactly what they're looking for within that store and help them make decisions. We're seeing a lot of that being deployed today. I know some of the work that Kevin's doing with Hudson Yards is using a lot of that type of technology. And then the big thing right now, of course, is with the digital assistants and things like the Echo and a lot of that technology in the home that is consistently monitoring everything that's occurring within your house and capturing information. It's only a matter of time as you adopt e-commerce that companies like Amazon and Alibaba will have just a more complete profile of you and your family, and not only your current behaviors, but the predictive behaviors that you'll have in the future as you age, which will be much greater insight than even members of your family have of themselves or of you as your parents. So I think that it goes back to the privacy issues that you were talking about. How do we look at privacy as part of that retail experience, because it's changing so dramatically? And then how do we actually compete in the marketplace to create an end-to-end experience that's highly competitive and delivers a great user experience?
Thanks. The next one to Stephen. How do you expect central banks to regulate cryptocurrencies to prevent money laundering? And to what extent can blockchain technology be used to protect the ownership of goods, hacker-proof and so on?
So, okay, you can't regulate cryptocurrencies. They are themselves designed to be unregulatable. What you can regulate is the bits around the edges that interact with cryptocurrencies. You can regulate exchanges or shops or any form of company, because a company has physical people, has employees, has a space. So that is the only way you'll be able to regulate it. So you see what China has done, initially banning exchanges from being able to convert fiat currency into cryptocurrency, and said you can only have cryptocurrency to cryptocurrency exchanges. But even now, it looks as though they might be trying to come down hard on that as well. So that we're probably going to see more of that coming on. There's an element of governments and regulators are worried, certainly in the Asian countries where I think this cryptocurrency speculative bubble took the general population much more by storm than maybe in other parts of the world, where it was possibly people who were playing with money that they could afford to lose, whereas I think in certain countries like Korea, they found people putting life savings into this sort of thing, and this is where politically it gets very difficult, and they feel very pressured to do something about it. So I think that's where that will come, and if then we go through another wave of innovation and adoption of this stuff, then maybe, like with the Napster case, it will force the central banks to think, to change and move forward into a world that they've been fairly reticent to move into, which is more digitization and more liberalization. People think about central banks having been around forever. They haven't. They've been around for about 100 years, and we had different sort of money technology before that. And so are they going to last forever? I very much doubt it. And so is this sort of innovation, whether this becomes the new normal, I doubt, but is it the thing that triggers change to happen and new things to happen in that space? What was your second question?
Second question, and to what extent can blockchain technology be used to protect the ownership?
Ownership of?
Against hacker proof.
Well, so one of the interesting things decentralizing technologies do, while it opens up entirely new security vectors. So clearly, you've got your data available in multiple places that isn't yours. So historically, we protect things by putting a big wall up around them and saying, don't come in. That is becoming more and more flawed, as we're seeing with some of the big hacking exploits that have happened over recent years, like with Equifax and things like that, where huge honeypots of data on somebody breaches, then you expose huge amounts of stuff. So the concept of being able to decentralize and effectively mean that you almost have to exert the same amount of energy to hack a single record that you would have previously just to hack the whole of either Equifax or JP Morgan, means that your returns on that investment are very diminished, so it means that it's very difficult. There are different attack vectors that are coming in there, so I think we will see entirely new security problems with also the benefits of more decentralized networks of data. But when we're thinking of things like personal data, quite frankly, I recommend we don't put any of that sort of stuff directly onto something like a blockchain ledger, and in fact, you keep that somewhere else, and then you just have a reference to it. Otherwise, you'll fall foul of things like the general data protection regulations and stuff like that. So I think we're going to see an entirely new security paradigm come forward, and I think we're going to see some mistakes as that matures. But I think the idea that decentralization can bring more robustness is a positive one. I think we just need to be fairly open with the fact that we don't entirely know how that's going to work in the future.
I understand. Now, two questions for Kevin. First one, can you please talk about AI as a threat to humankind, as many people believe? Will AI get to be so advanced that they will surpass humans in every field? What do you think about will an AI fool a human that it actually is a human?
I think that I would say that of all the things that I'm worried about in relationship to the species and its survival, that the likelihood that it will end with a superhuman AI is very, very, very low on the list. I think about things like topsoil. And I think about things like in bio. Those are things to keep you up at night. But I think that the concern is interesting, and we need to recognize in a way what we're asking when we ask it, which is what happens when we take all of human knowledge and intention and house it somewhere and give it agency. And the question is, how is it different? How is it different than a government? What is it that makes an AI more threatening than a state actor? What is it that makes an AI more threatening than Congress? Because the notion is the same, right? That it has somehow collected all of our data and intentions and knowledge, and is going to make a decision that we sort of understand and sort of don't, but it's going to spit something out, a yes or a no. And the difference between the AI and the government is that the government has an army. To me, that's more concerning. And I don't mean that I'm worried about the government. I just mean that I'm not especially worried that I think that we do that all the time. We delegate authority all the time. We don't think about it. And I think that we have already done that with huge amounts of our lives, and in general, it's working out. There's the other aspect of it, which is the notion that an AI has what we would call generalized artificial intelligence, that it's an AI that is capable of understanding everything and coming to some conclusions. And I think that then the question is, well, what is everything? What constitutes the everything, right? This camera on this phone is much, much better at recognizing images of people with really, really light skin than of people with really dark skin. Why? Not because anybody programmed it that way, but because it was trained on the data set of all images on the internet. And guess who that reflects, right? Now, is that everything? Is that everybody? It's never, right? I think that the principle of a generalized artificial intelligence is predicated on the notion that all things in the world are equal weight information and can all be somehow ingested. And I don't think that that's a real possibility. So I think I'm not worried that that generalized artificial intelligence is a viable possibility. I'm much more worried that the smaller AIs that run our lives in many ways, actually, not that they become super intelligent, but that they're not smart enough, that they break, that they fail, that they're fragile. I'm worried less that they come to some negative conclusion than that they just don't work. So those are the things that keep me awake at night. But I think that there's a popular imagination that it could end with, in this kind of Matrix-like situation. And I would say that's very, very low on the list of threats to our species. Would you agree?
No, I was going to throw another question to you. So rather than super intelligence and the threat of that, are you concerned about the fact that AI will further enable the haves versus the have-nots and the greater divide and the monopoly tendencies of big corporations with all the data? Is that a concern?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I am, but it's not the computational capabilities that are driving that. It's actually the intentions.
Right.
It's the criteria. It's like what are the criteria that we provide for their success? If those criteria are negative or negligent or even deliberate to further that divide, then that's what'll happen. But I'm worried about those intentions more than those technological capabilities. But I think the question is right, which is can they and will they extend those? I think they already have in so many ways, and I think they will continue to. I think that's a valuable inflection of it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of historic examples of that. When we talk about the digital divide that's been created. So previously, people were making decisions on who could actually access technology, who had access to it, and it preferred one segment of the population over another, and you saw that the way roads were built and transportation was designed. And then in this question that we're talking about here is if the knowledge going into the AI machine is biased, then it does tend to meet your own requirements that benefit you as the group, and that's a danger.
I mean, sorry, I was just sort of thinking a little bit further about it. There's this amazing analysis that somebody did of, what is the most common, what is the single most common job in every state of the United States? And in the majority of American states, the single most common job is a truck driver, right? Just by frequency. So it's roughly like 3.75 million jobs in the United States are truck drivers. We talk a lot about autonomous vehicles, I think the likelihood that any of us are going to buy an autonomous vehicle in the next couple of years is low. The idea that that logistics companies are going to buy self-driving trucks in the next couple of years is super high. That's just going to happen, and that's 3 to 4 million jobs right there, and then everybody that all the rest stops that those drivers relied on, all of the infrastructure that were around those 4 million jobs. But I think it comes back to, is that an AI problem, or is that just is that a social, on what do we place our priorities? And it comes back to these questions about what if we want to talk about impact investing, I don't know, is that positive? Where those criteria lie are more important than the technological capabilities per se.
Okay, thanks. You've already answered the second question regarding what will happen to the people that lose their job with your last feedback. Maybe the last question that I have here, and maybe you can open to the audience if we have a microphone, if someone has a question, but you can prepare already for the last question, which is, which books would you recommend in each sector, so blockchain, AI, and maybe Internet of Things, or whatever you would recommend people to read in the different topics? So to the audience, is there any questions? Please just raise your hand. We have another 5 minutes. Here's one question. Do we have a microphone? It's here, second row.
Hello.
Yeah, it's working.
Hello. This is for Kevin. You mentioned a black area during the development of AI. Some of this is because we were looking at it from a wrong perspective point of view. You said we were teaching machines how to think rather than to teach humans how to think. What has changed from back then until today, besides understanding that these algorithm-driven solutions have bugs, variables, that can affect systems? In addition, that these creations towards the future will become more and more embedded in our everyday life, and how can we prevent this from collapsing from happening? As humans, we will need to become experts of these technological events and patterns. And at the end of the day, large amounts of data management are contained through AI. Although this is humans writing and scripting to their own purpose, to facilitate and produce profitable systems.
Well, I would say there's 3 phases, two underway, two that were passed or that we're in, and one to come. The first one was really trying to treat a computer in the way that we understood our brain, which was not actually the right model to begin with, but let's just say that it was. We were trying to say, if we could figure out how a brain works, we'll get the computer to work like that. That really didn't work out, and that's not going to work out anytime soon. And then the second model, which was, if we can just get it enough data and just get it to crunch enough data and build out neural nets, which aren't really how the brain works, but let's say that they are. If we can just get enough data, it will produce the results that we want. And that works in the ways that it works, and it fails in the ways that it fails. The future that some people are building and that needs to be built is to figure out how to get humans to think like humans, how to get the machines to really think like machines, which has nothing to do with how humans think, and to figure out how to build the systems that bridge between them. One company, I have mixed feelings about it, but one company that's very good at this is called Palantir. They're very, very good, not just on the deep, like the really very, very hardcore machine analysis that they do, but also on how to engineer that in such a way that humans can make use of it. That's unusual. It's one of the things that has really set them apart. I think there will be other companies like that, other approaches like that, and figuring out how to how to build those sort of dashboards between so that humans and machines can understand one another. I think that's the meat of what's ahead, and I'm very interested in the companies that are building it.
Thanks. So, in the interest of time, maybe your book, Peter, from you.
So I haven't got one that's specific to blockchain, but one that I read recently, which is sort of regard this entire evolution of technology, emerging technologies, and things like AI and the data, is a quite an accessible book called Homo Deus, which sort of talks about a bit of history, about where we've been. In fact, there's a previous book called Sapiens, but you could read this on its own. Talks a little bit about where we've been and how we've evolved and how our society has evolved, and the way we've governed and way even religions have come through different parts of our history, and then looks forward to how, you know, the next set of religions may come out of the data world, the world where the machine knows more about you than yourself, or your family or your friends. So very interesting food for thought, and it's couched in quite an accessible way, and it's quite shocking, but also then it does wrap up a little bit at the end, saying I was deliberately being a little bit shocking, but it was trying to make you think.
Thanks.
I would totally second that. Homo Deus is a phenomenal book, a bit shocking, but really good. I would recommend a book that came out probably about 5 years ago called The Information by James Glick, which is a history of the idea of information, which, you know, very, very few people ever stop to really think about what that notion is and how it propagated, how it moves, how it grows, how it accrues value. Not data, you know, not computers, but information, which is what leads to information theory, which is what leads to computation, which is what leads to everything we have. But it's an extraordinary history analysis of the notion of information and how it becomes increasingly valuable as the species evolves. So.
Thanks.
I had mentioned earlier the biography of Leonardo da Vinci. The author also did several other biographies, one on Steve Jobs. But the biography on Leonardo da Vinci is just really interesting because you think you know him as an artist, but you learn about him as an engineer, and you know about his great works as an artist, you know, whether it was The Last Supper or the Mona Lisa, and it talks about all the science that went in behind understanding what made that smile so unique, and all of the geometry that goes into the painting The Last Supper that makes that a very active three-dimensional experience when you view it. And so, you know, here was a person, you know, in this Renaissance period who was able really to bridge all of these different disciplines. And I think that's exactly where we are today when we talk about things like AI and privacy. You know, we want to use the technology, but we want to use it properly. We want to use the technology to solve problems, but really to solve problems worth solving that bring shared value and actually benefit society. So I think that type of thinking is very important.
Thank you very much to all of you for the great discussion. I think we can wrap it up for now. We have now a 10 minutes break and then the afternoon session starts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure meeting you.
Lovely to meet you.
Yeah.